Just working on going live, Mr.
Oh,
Mayor.
okay. Yep. Sounds good.
And we are live and ready when you are.
Okay. Sounds good. We'll go ahead and call this work session to order. Monday, January 10th, 4:30 p.m. The discussion topic today will be the Seldovia Permanent Fund follow-up from November 8th, 2021 meeting regarding permanent capital management company presentation. And do we want to go ahead and give a little backdrop either from Rachel? You want to go ahead and chime in on this before we go to audience?
You bet, Mayor. And I have a PowerPoint presentation prepared to walk the council through with a couple questions for council's consideration.
Okay, perfect.
So happy New Year, everybody. Thank you so much for making the time to continue the conversation on the Seldovia Permanent Fund. I'm going to need permission from the host in order to share my screen. Thank you so much, Radzi. Okay. All right. So we're just going to start off with a brief overview of the Seldovia Permanent Fund. According to our code, the purpose of the fund is to preserve and trust assets of the city for the benefit of present and future generations of Seldovia residents. The permanent fund was started with $500,000. The investment started with Merrill Lynch, and it was created in 1995. The investments occur under the prudent man rule, which means it's risk adverse, the investment of the funds, and there's no speculation. So it's not like we can take it and, do land investments or something like that, that is geared towards, we know that something's going to happen in the future. Investments can only be in the form of government obligations or bonds, bank certificates of deposit, or corporate obligations. Also in the code, it requires that the permanent fund have at least 10% of the fund income or an amount equal to the inflation rate be reinvested into the fund. So that means that every single year the fund should be growing. It also, Seldovia Municipal Code also states that if there's a loss in principal, so our initial principal was $500,000, that loss be reimbursed before the fund is used again. And fun fact about the permanent fund, at the end of the year, any unexpended interest becomes principal. So we should have theoretically been seeing the fund grow since 1995. The income, income not needed to be reimbursed back into the fund can be used for capital expenses or grants. So we have to put at least 10% or an amount equal to inflation. If we've already done that and we have excess income, then we can use that for capital expenditures or grants. As said earlier, any income not used by the end of the fiscal year becomes principal. Principal can only be used for land acquisitions, and the fund overall can only be used with council permission. So interest can be used for capital expenses or grants, and the fund principal only for land. We currently have our Seldovia Permanent Fund held with the Alaska Municipal League Local Investment Pool, which is called AMLIP, and that money's in Key Bank. And APCM, who we heard from in November, they manage AMLIP. So they already manage the city's permanent fund. It's been advised that AMLIP is not a place to put the permanent funds. It's a place instead to have liquid cash that you can access on a quick basis, but it's not for long-term investments or goals. And cities like the city of Fairbanks have been able to manage their permanent fund so that it generates enough interest or revenue to support a percentage of the annual operating expenses of the city. And I believe it's 4%. Don't quote me on that, but I believe APCM told me that Fairbanks has been able to aggressively manage their permanent fund dollars so that 4% of their operating budget comes from their permanent fund. Our current balance of the permanent fund in Seldovia is $540,144. The city owes the permanent fund $30,000 for the harbor kiosks. So theoretically, the amount the permanent fund should contain is $570,144. And a fun fact, from July of 2014 through May of 2021, so 7 years, we generated basically $41,000 in interest. Here is a snapshot of the ways that the permanent fund has been used since 2014 by the city of Seldovia. So we've taken out of the fund $590,435. You can see in 2014, we used it for insurance. Also, we used it for the harbor marginal float upgrade project. We used it for personnel, a personnel payback. We used it for Mission Street roof repairs. That's starting in 2016. In 2017, you can see we used it for insurance again, as well as repairing the city office roof. And there were other years where there were withdrawals, but there was no explanation provided by the statement that the bank gave me. Because back in November, I received a question from a council member. How often or how frequently or what amount does the city use the permanent fund for emergency purposes? And so this is just to give the council an idea of what kind of withdrawals we've made on it that may not have aligned with the original intent of the Seldovia Permanent Fund. So council's first question during this work session: aside from the Seldovia Permanent Fund, the city has fund balance revenue, as well as revenue in the major maintenance and repair fund that could be used for one-time emergency expenses. So we already have some money set aside for emergencies. Does the council wish to see a portion of the permanent fund set aside for emergency expense purposes? So that goes outside of the original intent of the permanent fund, but that's how we've used it in the past. If that's the case, that portion of the permanent fund set aside for emergency purposes would remain in AMLIP and would not be invested to generate more interest so that it could be considered liquid cash and available on short notice. I've asked APCM if the city wished to make quick withdrawals and emergency purposes, could we still keep the permanent fund in one lump sum? And their preference was not to do that. So if council had a wish to see a portion used for emergency purposes, that should be kept separate. So the first question is, do you want to see the permanent fund set aside for emergency expense purposes, or do you want to see the full portion of the permanent fund available for other investment purposes, aka using APCM or another investment firm to invest the whole amount more aggressively for the city? So that's the first question.
Yes.
Through the mayor, Councilmember Nathan, yes to which question?
The first one that you just asked, I think we need to start generating a little more revenue with the investment that we have. Now, I didn't quite understand. You said that AMLITS is that the fund is still in AMLITS, even though we would try to use this investment firm we've been talking to enhance our status there, generate more revenue. So we're not moving
Through the
out
mayor,
of AMLITS.
if council wished to set a portion of the permanent fund aside for emergency purposes, so you wanted the city to have, the ballpark figure I was thinking, because our assets are getting older, is 70,000. If council wanted to only invest more aggressively $500,000, you could set the difference, which would be $70,144, and keep that in AMLIP, but the $500,000 would be invested in a different way. So it would not remain in AMLIP.
Okay. That sounds like a reasonable option. We could haggle about how much, but I think that general pattern, I think, it makes sense.
Yeah, Rachel, or, yeah. I thought you said the money from that fund couldn't be used for that, but yet we're using it, we've been using it for that.
Correct.
Okay, so if it can't, so who monitors that?
Through the mayor, Councilmember Sweat, council could change code to permit the use of the permanent fund for emergency purposes with the city's intent of then paying it back. In terms of monitoring the use of the permanent fund, those purchases or uses of the permanent fund by the city in the past should have been authorized by council. So you would have seen it through ordinances, pulling the money out of the permanent fund.
Okay. Still a little confusing, but get that, I guess. Thanks.
I'd like to see it used as it was intended. Move it and invest it. That's all I have.
Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Yep, go ahead, Vivian.
Well, I think the question I have is, does the council feel and does the staff feel that we need to take some of this money in order to have an emergency fund? It looks like we've been using it for that, not quite what the intentions are for the permanent fund, but we've been doing that. My apprehension is that we keep on buttering our dish with monies that we really don't have. So I guess the conversation that we need to have is, do we need to have an emergency fund money put out of, taken aside from permanent fund monies, and then invest? And I'm totally in favor of investing the permanent fund monies into similar to what Fairbanks is doing, and use it, the part of money that you can use to help your operating budget. But I think that we're all in support of getting that money working for us. The question is, how much of that money, and should we be using that money as an emergency fund? I guess that's the conversation that we all need to have. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Vivian.
Mr. Mayor.
Yep, go ahead, George, and then I'll get you next, Jennifer.
Do we have some numbers, the projected revenue that say Fairbanks was making? I believe you and I talked about that in your office. Do you have some hard numbers?
We can't hear you.
Sorry about that, Councilmember Rojas. Through the mayor, yes, Councilmember Nathan, that's part of the second part of the presentation.
Well, what I was getting around to is perhaps we could go ahead and invest everything we have. And at some point, depending on how much is being generated, say in 6 months or whatever, take a certain amount out from the revenues of the fund to use as our emergency deal. Just give us a little time to get the thing established and get a little money made from it, and then pull out whatever we decide is necessary. That kind of maybe protects us a little bit, keeps the principal together a little longer.
Through the mayor, Councilmember Nathan, that is an approach that whatever financial advisor the city decides to work with, we could take. However, there's been the caution that, say the city were to put the full principal into a more aggressive investment strategy and then the market dips. If you were to make a withdrawal, you're not going to have that same amount you started out with. So the intent of a more aggressive investment strategy is you're not going to touch it possibly for a few years.
Did you have anything back you wanted to add to that, George, or you want?
No, I'm just ruminating here. We're going to need some ordinance changes as well to do what we're talking about, or not.
Through the mayor, correct. If the council wishes to see the permanent fund be used for emergency purposes, or to see the permanent fund invested in a different way, then yes, there'll be a ordinance to change city code for that.
Okay, let's go ahead and Jennifer, go ahead and if you've got any comments.
Yeah, maybe I'm supposed to know this already, but you just said that there is a major maintenance fund and whatever else. What or do you have totals on those? What are we looking at there? Is that something we
Um,
know?
Through the mayor, Councilmember Swick, I'm sorry, I should have had that information handy. I'm just going to go off of memory. I want to say the major maintenance and repair fund within AMLIP has a balance of about $220,000. And then I don't have the fund balance totals of the general fund and the special revenue funds because we're going to have that a more substantial discussion on that in the future.
So that 220 is separate from the 570, or is that part of it? Okay,
Correct, it's separate.
could be used as emergency if needed, if we invest the whole thing.
Correct.
Okay. I would like to think that that's substantial enough, maybe. I mean, who knows, but yeah.
Mr. Mayor,
Yep, go ahead.
my understanding was this fund is liquid. So if we had to dip into it, in addition to the 200 and odd thousand that you're talking about, that could be done. So we're really covered both ways. I think, I didn't realize you had such a large amount available to us for emergency purposes. Seems like we should invest as much as we possibly can and leave that what we already have as an emergency buffer and go from there.
Right there, the major maintenance and repair fund, the intent for that is it's also defined in code. And I can't recall if it specifies emergencies uses of those funds, but it's for keeping up with our city facilities, the harbor, the dock. It's broken out into different categories of how it can be used. So there's also some restrictions to that. But for me, to go back to Councilmember Rojas's question, with the city having a significant deferred maintenance as we've had and our aging infrastructure, definitely having access to liquid cash that the city can pull on an emergency basis is very important. We've taken strides to remove the city relying on the permanent fund to pay for our insurance. This year, we set up a payment plan with our insurance company, AML-JIA, where we're paying them in installments. The council had a discussion about reducing our general liability amount owed to them. I think it was $92,000, but we decided to keep everything insured as is and instead go on a payment plan where we're just paying a very small fee for doing that. So by taking off the insurance, relying on the permanent fund for the insurance and having major maintenance, I do think the city would be covered, but I'm uncertain. Like I don't have the most complete picture of what critical failures could be in our future with the deferred maintenance we've been having. And I would think that possibly taking some portion of the permanent fund and setting it aside for emergency purposes is something plausible that the council could entertain because the city has done that in the past.
When I'm forgetting in the presentation, did he suggest or did he touch on leaving money in and having both the AMLEP and the new accounts? Did he talk about that at all? I don't remember. About having, is it a smart idea to keep both going?
Through the mayor, Councilmember Swick, Blake with APCM touched on the fact that the city should be very certain about the amount that it wants to put into a more aggressive investment for the very fact that if we need access to it because of an emergency, it may not be what we're hoping it's going to be. And so if there is a portion that the city thinks, and I've had a separate conversation with him, if there's a portion the city thinks it might need to access in a shorter time frame, it would be best to not commingle those amounts, but instead keep the funds separate. So keep your nest egg, so to speak, the permanent funds separate from the portion of the permanent fund you're thinking you might have to rely on for emergency purposes.
And was there a time frame on immediate, I guess? Are we talking 6 months, a year, 5 years? Do we know any of that?
Let me just skip ahead to this slide that I took from his presentation. Let me share my screen here. So APCM said if the city had $500,000 to invest and did not include any contributions or withdrawals over 10 years, here are 3 scenarios that we could expect to see. The first scenario, which is a more risk adverse or more conservative scenario, you could see anything from at worst case 565 to best case over $1 million, but most likely you're going to get closer to $854 million. If second case, which is you take a little bit more risk, but you're still more conservative, you can see the medium route of not touching that $500,000 initial investment and growing by $405,000 or almost $1 million in 10 years without touching it. And then if you're very aggressive and want to take more chances, which APCM says this is not the best route for a municipality, you could expect over $900,000 in the course of 10 years without touching that fund. So this is, I guess, I hope Councilmember Swick, this answers your question, just to see 10 years not touching it. I'd say 10 years could be your short-term horizon for the fund.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess it wouldn't be a terrible idea to keep a chunk of change. I mean, if in the long run over the investment, that difference of the 70,000 could be substantial, I guess, but it also could make a bigger difference at home if we needed it to. So I wouldn't be opposed to keeping some in AMLIP, I guess.
Yeah, I'll just chime in too. I think given what you just presented there, I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea to keep a set amount of dollars aside, dedicated for whatever we want to do, versus having to deal with all the small amounts that equal up, you know, and all the various funds that equal up to the aggregate of the two, whatever that was, the 220. And then in terms of investing, if we took, say, the 500, yeah, I mean, I'm agree. I'd like to go not super conservative, but, you know, not super aggressive either. Find the middle of the road, something that, you know, is a little more prudent. Obviously, things are still fairly volatile here at the moment. I mean, the overall trend has been, you know, upwards in the obviously here over the last number of years in the stock market, but at some point, you know, I don't want to be on the outside looking in when the bubble does burst here if we throw all our eggs in one basket. So, but I think we're all thinking, you know, somewhat along the similar lines here.
So, council, is it safe to say there's general consensus that keeping a portion set aside for now would be viewed favorably by the council?
Mr. Mayor, if
Because-
I may. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, I was just going to add, Councilmember Rojas, that council could always decide in the future to take that set aside amount and put it all in once, you know, if we get a handle on our infrastructure and we don't foresee any major failures and we've been able to put money into the major maintenance and repair fund and we're growing as an organization, then you guys could put the full amount into that investment fund. So that's not out of the question either.
Yeah, I mean, this is a long-term strategy. We don't want to be playing around with it in the short term. We're not going to gain much short term. I mean, it's compound interest, long-term is where we're going to get our gains here. But making sure that we do have some reserves if we absolutely need them.
Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Yep, go ahead, Vivian.
Yeah, I think, I agree. I think the 500,000 going with Model 5, the middle of the investments is a smart option. I think that if we are going to take X amount of dollars for our safety net, that we put it through ordinance and we have it documented as what we're doing. And that we actually have it at that point where we have that one document that our city manager showed us that it did not, when there was $50,000 withdrawn, it didn't specifically say what it was for. So I'm hoping moving forward from this, that we actually have documentation that says what we're doing with this money and that we're cautious of what this money is for and that it has a purpose, not just to fill in the gaps, but it actually has a purpose. And but I think getting this money to workforce is something that council's been trying to come to terms with. And then taking X amount of dollars and have it for a safety net is a safe option for the city. And like our city manager just said, if we look like we're rolling forward, we could take that money that we held for a safety net and invest it. But this looks like, that 10-year is a good chunk of time that hopefully that money could make something for the city and we could use it to work for us instead of against us. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Vivian.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen again and go to the second part of the discussion. All right, so for 2022, Council identified as its top large priority improving city finances overall, including lost revenue and the Seldovia Permanent Fund, specifically amending Seldovia Municipal Code regarding the Permanent Fund and making better investments. To accomplish this priority, Council will need to select another method of managing the funds, so no longer using AMLIP, and amending code so that investments are not bond specific, but allow for investments in equities, emerging markets, commodities, you name it. So taking these steps will allow the permanent fund to generate more interest at a higher risk, but it will therefore generate more revenue for the fund. On November 8th of last year, the Alaska Permanent Capital Management Company gave a presentation to council on the permanent fund and their organization. Our city attorney was the one who originally recommended reaching out to APCM to see if they'd have an interest in working with Seldovia. They said that their minimum amount for considering us a client would be $500,000. So we do meet that threshold. APCM, they have 31 municipal clients, including the Kenai Peninsula Borough, Soldotna, Kenai. They partner with clients through a prudent investment management process. So you'll remember that we have to follow the prudent man rule. So they offer investment strategies that aren't just trying to get you the biggest bang for your buck. They consider the fact that you're a municipality. They don't have any self-gain. They're a fiduciary. So they don't do things that aren't in our best interest. So they're not trying to sell us a product that their investment firm controls. They look out for the best interest of their clients. They also, when they look at investment strategies, they incorporate and protect investment against inflation. So remember, our code says that we have to take 10% of the income or at least the amount minimum to inflation and put that back into the fund. And the city has been looking at the code and trying to manage the fund according to the code because AMLIP does not do that. If we were to turn the permanent fund over to a financial advisor or an investment firm, they would do that for the city. They would actively do that. A benefit from them is that they give or conduct annual formal reviews. So they'll look at the guidelines that the city said they wanted the investment to occur. They'll look at our portfolio to see if they're meeting our objectives or goals, and they'll give presentations or even, I personally like this bit, tell the city, hey, if you do that, that's going to go against what you initially told us you wanted. So they're kind of like a safe, accountability partner. And they also utilize clear and transparent reporting. As shown earlier, this is what they provided us in the presentation about how they could take an initial investment of $500,000 and invest it over these 3 different strategies. I heard support for Model 5, which would take more risks, but it does not appear the city would lose any money with this investment. And these, because if we initially put 500,000, it's not like we're going to drop down to 200,000 with what they're showing us. If anything, we're most likely going to fall into this horizon. And you'll remember from earlier, in 7 years, we made $41,000 in interest. With this scenario, with 10 years, the city will make, if you go with the most conservative route, $354,000.
Can I stop you there?
You bet. Mayor, Councilmember Kennedy has a question.
I can't see it from here, but does it show an annual rate of return, percentage rate of return for those different investments? Like 8%, 15%? Is that in there?
No, that could have been though in their earlier presentation. I just took a screenshot of this, but I can look for that and share that with you later. Make a note.
Because in the past, most of these funds that I've dealt with generally see somewhere between 7.5% and 15%, rate of returns. And I too would be in favor of the middle one. But I'd like to see us invest 520 rather than 500 and just retain 50,000 with the thought that if we knew what the annual rate of return is, we could possibly make up some of that money that we're holding back over that time. That's my thought process behind that. I've, took money out of investment funds like this and seen the losses caused by it in the past. So that's my concern with it.
That's a great suggestion. And I will look for that and share that with you in the council. This is just to show their fee. So if the account has a balance up to $1 million, their annual advisory fee would be 1%. So if we took $500,000 and we invested it with APCM, it would be an initial annual expense or a fee with them of $5,000, which hopefully would be negated with the interest generated by them investing it. So according to Seldovia Municipal Code, all city contracts for supplies, services, and construction shall be awarded by competitive sealed bidding. However, the code allows the city to secure professional services without competition in an amount not to exceed 50,000. It also allows for the city to secure professional services without competition when the city is obligated to pay no more than 10,000. So what that means is that the city can enter into a sole source agreement with APCM. So the next question before the council is, does the council wish for the city to issue a request for proposals from investment firms or advisors regarding the management of the Seldovia Permanent Fund? Or does council wish to enter into an agreement with APCM regarding the management of the Seldovia Permanent Fund?
I would just, Mayor.
Yep, go.
Mayor Campbell. I'd like to see us do the second.
That's with APCM.
Yeah.
John, is that what, can you clarify that?
Well, she'd have to go back to the screen. Oops, sorry. I'd like to see us do the second choice is what I was saying.
Okay, Rachel, and that was, the second one was ACPM, right?
Correct.
Or
It was a sole-
APCM?
Yep, sole source with APCM.
Okay,
Yeah,
Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Mayor,
yep, go ahead, George.
I'd support that. I think that's the right thing to do. We've dealt with these guys over a pretty good period of time. They've got a very good track record with the clients that they have now. We could spend a year beating the bushes trying to find something better. I think this is the way to go. Sole source agreement with them.
Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Yep, go ahead, Vivian.
Yeah, I would concur with that. I think we've had a presentation by them, and I think they've got our best interests for us. So I would agree, go with the second option.
Okay, Bobby?
Yeah, I would go with the second option also.
Okay.
All
Yep,
right.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, Mayor. I just have some modeling that APCM shared with me from their current clients that I'm going to throw up on the screen. They sent this to me yesterday. And so I've had just a little bit of time to digest it. And so these are actual clients that they have. I believe they gave me 3 client examples and they didn't put the client's name. So we're looking at one client, representative account A. Here it's showing you year to date, the permanent fund and where they wanted to be. So this is the year to date where they've gotten that permanent fund for that organization. It's grown significantly, I would say. And then where they
Rachel. Oh, it's kind of hard to see the numbers from here. Do you mind adding those numbers to your dialogue? Oh, thank you.
does that help? Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So this organization that they're a client or that's a client of APCM, here's where they wanted to be and here's where they ended. And then this is to show a projection of where they see based on that client's particular interest in using the fund, what direction they're headed. So it looks like their client wants to withdraw or take from the permanent fund over time. So a historical look at the organization. And here's the total rate of return. Here's how, for the representative account A client, how they've invested it over time. So just showing the different components of their portfolio. So US large cap equity, looks like the biggest one has been US fixed income. And then here's another example. And I'm sorry that I haven't had a chance to digest this with them, so maybe my interpretation is incorrect of how it's supposed to be viewed, but year to date, here's where they're at. You can see where they've grown the permanent fund for that organization. And the way I'm interpreting it is that here this is where they want to be at a year, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years, but perhaps it's a historical look that 10 years ago, that's where they were at. I think that's the better view. So 10 years, they were at 9.11 million, and then they grew to 9.31 million. And then 5 years, ago, that's where they were at. 3 years, last year, this year. So I think that's actually how we're supposed to be viewing it. So you can see that they've been able to grow this organization's permanent fund. And then same thing for representative C, client C. 10 years ago, here's where they're at. Year to date, here's where they're at. So it looks like their client has been able to see a growth in their permanent fund, but has withdrawn from it. And these graphs were generated by APCM at the request of Councilmember Nathan, who specifically wanted information on APCM and municipal clients. So how APCM has helped municipal clients. So this is an example.
Right. So,
And here's your rate of total return, your rate of return here.
Mayor Campbell.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, if you look at the examples that they presented, what is there? There's 5 of them there. Every one of them are between that 7.5% and 15% that I was speaking of earlier.
Yep.
We ought to be right somewhere in the middle of that, in my opinion, when it comes to our investment and strategy. Long term, anyway.
All right, I'm going to stop my share here and I'm open to any questions. It sounds like the council is interested in a sole source, considering a sole source agreement with APCM. And so that would come before you either at the next council meeting or the council meeting after that in the form of a resolution entering into an agreement with them. Does that sound good?
Yeah, it sounds good to me unless there's any objections from anyone else.
I just have a question, Mr. Mayor.
Yep, go ahead, George.
What about the ordinance changes we were talking about? We're going to have,
Correct. We're going
are
to have that as well, Councilmember Nathan. So this will just be, we're entering into an agreement with them. And then we'll hopefully simultaneously or shortly after, I want to ask the city attorney for some input on how to make those code changes, but then we'll have the code changes come before council and an ordinance as well.
yeah, I was going to say those changes are probably not going to be simply done. I think you're on the right track asking for some advice from the attorney.
And I believe Councilmember Swick and Councilmember Nathan, and forgive me if I forgot a council member, but at least you both wanted to be champions on this effort. So I will pull you into the fold for any specific questions or meetings that I have with the city attorney.
Thank you.
And
And when-
oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, and when are we going to determine the amount of money that we're going to hold back? When is that conversation happening, or how and how?
That's a great question, Councilmember Rojas. I think that would happen with APCM. So we would enter into an agreement with APCM to help manage the Seldovia Permanent Fund. And then in consultation with them, when they're developing the portfolio for the city, then the city could say, we want to see some modeling, more specific modeling. This is the amount we feel comfortable with. And then you guys would set it with APCM then.
Okay, the amount that we're retaining for our emergency fund and what we're going to invest at that point. Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
Okay, anyone have any additional comments before we go to public? Okay, is there anyone in the public that wishes to comment on the topic tonight, subject topic?
I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, sounds good, Heidi. Okay, well, thank you, Rachel, Heidi, appreciate that. And did you guys have any more or need any more information to proceed moving forward with this?
Oh, Mayor, this was great. I appreciate the council's time in providing me some informal direction, and then we'll have formal conversations when the legislation hits your agendas.
Okay, sounds good. All right, we'll get that moving. If there's not anything else, we'll go ahead and conclude this meeting, and then we'll be back here in about 45 minutes for the regular meeting this evening. So at this time, we'll go ahead and stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, see you in a little bit.
Yep, thanks. Bye.
Thank you.